Shalom, welcome back. We're continuing on with our study of the Essenes versus the early Jewish Christian groups. We're trying to determine whether they're the same group or not. You see listed our sources that we have for the Essenes. As far as our sources for the Jewish Christian groups, we'll use passages from the New Testament. We use the writings of Epiphanius in his Panarion, and the Nazarene Acts and Homilies, as well as any other historical references we have. Okay, so we left off in Josephus' War 289. The next connection we see is Josephus says what they most of all honor after Elohim himself is the name of their legislator, whom if anyone blaspheme, he is punished capitally. They also think it a good thing to obey their elders and the majority. So they, the majority, of course, they were known to take votes on different issues and such. But what stood out to me was this name of their legislator. Now, in many of the translations of Josephus, there'll be a footnote here and it'll say Moses. However, the thing is that Josephus was a Jew. He wasn't a Roman writing about the Essenes. He was a Jew. And he doesn't say our legislator. He's not talking about Moses. He's talking about their legislator, whom I believe to be Yeshua, whose name that they're not allowed to blaspheme. Now, does that not sound a lot like Christianity, where the name of Yeshua is reverenced? In fact, he'll say later that even when they were tortured, they refused to reject their lawgiver. Now, for millennia, Christians have been put to the torture trying to get them to renounce Yeshua. It's not something you see in the Jewish people. Like, did the pagans tie up the Jews and tell them to reject Moses? No, they would tie them up and try to get them to break the Torah, but you never saw them being made to blaspheme the name of Moses. That's what makes me think that this is talking about Yeshua. He goes on to say, and as for death, if it will be for their glory, they esteem it better than living always. And indeed, our war with the Romans gave abundant evidence what great souls they had in their trials, wherein, although they were tortured and distorted, burnt and torn to pieces, and went through all kinds of instruments of torment, that they might be forced to either blaspheme their legislator, again, does this sound like they're talking about Moses, or does this sound like, somebody torturing the Christians? I mean, the Romans, of course, were torturing Christians for hundreds of years until suddenly they switched sides and became the Catholic Church, allegedly. Or to eat what was forbidden them, yet could they not be made to do either of them. Now, keep in mind, if this is the early Christian groups, and we know that the Essenes did not eat meat, they would rather die than to eat meat. Now, that's pretty devoted to a course of action which Paul told us was done away with. Or, that supposedly Peter was given this vision that told him he could eat animals. But yet here we see in 70 Common Era, during the war with the Romans, they'd rather die and be tortured to death than to eat anything forbidden to them. No, nor once to flatter their tormentors or to shed a tear, but they smiled in their very pains and laughed those to scorn who inflicted the torments upon them, and resigned up their souls with great alacrity, as expecting to receive them again. So again, ask yourselves, does this description sound like what we hear about Christian martyrs? Or does this sound like I'm sure that obviously the Jews were tortured to death in the Inquisition. But this description about blaspheming their legislator, to me it sounds more like like the Christian persecution. They are long-lived also, insomuch that many of them live above 100 years by means of the simplicity of their diet. Nay, as I think, by means of the regular course of life they observe also, they contemn the miseries of life and are above pain by the generosity of their mind. And here's a quote from Hegesippus. He's quoted by Eusebius in, I believe this is from church history or ecclesiastical history. Some of these heretics laid an information against Simeon, the son of Clopas, that's Simon Bar Clopas, as being of the family of David and a Christian, and on these charges he suffered martyrdom when he was 120 years old, at the reign of Trajan Caesar, when Atticus was consular legate in Syria. So you see here that Simon Bar Clopas lived to be 120 years old. In the second paragraph, the same historian mentions others also of the family of one of the reputed brothers of the Savior named Judas. So Yeshua's brother Judas also lived to that same time frame, or so he was probably over 100 years old himself. In the Panarian, Epiphanius says that James, the brother of the Master, died in virginity at the age of 96. Of course, he was murdered, so there's no telling how long he would have lived had that not happened to him, but he was murdered at the age of 96. Hippolytus says, but here also there are many, very many of them of so great longevity as even to live longer than 100 years. They assert, therefore, that the cause of this arises from their extreme devotion to religion and their condemnation of all excesses in regard to what is served up as food, and from their being temperate and incapable of anger. So, again, Hippolytus speaks of it in the present tense, so it may be that he was aware of communities of Essenes that lived at that age. They had a doctrine that Yahuwah controls all things. In Antiquities, we see this where Josephus says the doctrine of the Essenes is this, that all things are best ascribed to Elohim. This is reflected in the Nazarene Acts, where Simon Peter says, he who believes that the world is administered by the providence of Yahuwah El Shaddai ought not to take it amiss in whatever way when particular things are done, being assured that the righteousness of Yahuwah guides to a favorable and fitting issue even those things that seem superfluous or contrary in any business, and especially toward those who worship him more intimately. And therefore he who is assured of these things, as I've said, if anything occur contrary to his expectation, he knows how to drive away grief from his mind on that account, holding it unquestionable in his better judgment that by the government of the good Yahuwah, even what seems contrary may be turned to good. This is also reflected in the Didache. You will not associate with the self-important, but you will walk with the righteous and humble. Then even when accidents happen to you, such will be received as good, for nothing happens without Elohim knowing. The Essenes believed that baptism was a substitute for sacrifices. In the Antiquities, Josephus says, they teach the immortality of souls and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for, and when they send what they have dedicated to Elohim into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices because they have more pure lustrations of their own. So, what is a lustration? It's kind of an older English word that's not really used today. But it means to purify by expiatory sacrifice, ceremonial washing, or some other ritual action. And the example given in the dictionary I use, it says a soul lustrated in the baptismal waters. So they basically have, instead of the sacrifices, they have these lustrations, which are, a form of baptism or ceremonial washing, a mikvah, on which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple. In the Nazarene Acts, it says, "But when the time began to draw near that what was waiting in the Mosaic institution should be supplied, as we have said, and that the Navi, or the prophet, should appear, of whom he had been foretold that he should warn them by the mercy of Yeshua to cease from sacrificing, lest they might suppose that on the cessation of sacrifice there was no remission of sins for them, he instituted a mikvah by water amongst them, in which they might be absolved from all their sins on the invocation of his name, and for the future, following a perfect life, might abide in immortality, being purified not by the blood of beasts, but by the purification of the wisdom of Yahuwah, which is Yeshua." So we see here that Yeshua was teaching to cease from sacrificing and to instead use mikvah by water to cleanse yourself. This, of course, is reflected in the quotation we have from the Nazarene Gospel, the Gospel of the Hebrews, which has Yeshua saying, "I came to abolish sacrifices, and if you cease not from sacrifice, wrath will not cease from you." Philo says about the Essenes that they number something more than 4,000, and they derive their name from their piety, though not according to any accurate form of the Grecian dialect, because they are above all men devoted to the service of Elohim, not sacrificing living animals, but studying rather to preserve their own minds in a state of holiness and purity. So again, it's another witness that the Essenes did not sacrifice animals. And again, in the Panarian, Epiphanius says that the Nazareans were Jews who kept all the Jewish observances. They would not offer sacrifice or eat meat. In their eyes, it was unlawful to eat meat or to make sacrifices with it. Speaking of the Essenes, he says that El-Chai, one of their founders, bans burnt offerings and sacrifices as something foreign to Elohim, and never offer to him on the authority of the fathers and the law, yet he says we must pray toward Jerusalem, but rejects the Jewish custom of eating meat and the rest and the altar and the fire as something foreign to Elohim. In the following words, he claims that water is fortunate while fire is hostile, where he says, "Children, go not unto the sight of fire, but rather go to the sound of water." So this El-Chai, which means the hidden Elohim, this is something that Epiphanius ridicules throughout the Panari and those that followed the teachings of El-Chai. I think it's very possible that this Gospel of El-Chai could have been a gospel or a text that was written by Yeshua himself. But notice that here we see the Essenes, or the doers, following the same practices that the Essenes did. Speaking about the Ebionites, he says, "But they say that he came and instructed us, as their so-called gospel says, I came to abolish the sacrifice, and if you cease not from sacrifice, wrath will not cease from you." And further, he says they lay down certain assents and instructions on the supposed assents of James, as though he were giving orders against the temple and sacrifices and the fire on the altar. Nazarene Acts says, "But maybe, although you live with me, you do not know my manner of life." This is Kepha speaking, of course. "I live on bread alone with olives and seldom even pot herbs." So Kepha doesn't eat meat. And Jerome says, now Jerome, when he's quoting from Josephus, he seems to have a different version of Josephus. And we know that Josephus wrote more than one version of his works. One was written in Greek, which is the copy we have, and there was also an Aramaic version. So Jerome may have been reading from the Aramaic, but he said that Josephus describes three sects of the Jews: the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. On the last of these he bestows wondrous praise, because they practiced perpetual abstinence from wives, wine, and flesh, and made a second nature of their daily fast. So in the version of Josephus that Jerome had, it specifically said that the Essenes did not eat meat. which again falls in line with what we know about the early Jewish Christian groups. Josephus says that they had a mandatory sharing of wealth. In the Antiquities, he says it also deserves our admiration how much the Essenes exceeded all other men that addict themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, and indeed to such a degree that it hath never appeared among other men. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. So notice that Josephus says that it's only among the Essenes that this practice is seen, where the people share their wealth in a community. But then when we go to the book of Acts, we see that the Nazareans were following the same practices and sharing their wealth, where we see this example of Hananiah with Sapphira, his wife. They sold a possession and kept back part of the price, and then when Kepha confronts him, Hananiah falls down dead and breathes his last, and shortly thereafter his wife does the same thing. So for Josephus to say no other group other than the Essenes does this, and then we see the Nazareans doing it, it kind of lends to this assertion that I'm trying to make, that these were actually the same group of people. Philo says that there is one storehouse among them. All their expenses are in common. Their garments belong to them all in common. Their food is common, since they all eat in messes. For there is no other people among which you can find a common use of the same house, a common adoption of one mode of living, and a common use of the same table more thoroughly established, in fact, than among this tribe. And is not this very natural? For whatever they, after having been working during the day, receive for their wages, that they do not retain as their own, but bring it into the common stock, and give any advantage that is to be derived from it to all who desire to avail themselves of it. So you see this sharing of wealth there. He goes on to say, those who are sick are not neglected because they are unable to contribute to the common stock, inasmuch as the tribe have in their public stock a means of supplying their necessities and aiding their weaknesses, so that from their ample means they may support them liberally and abundantly. And they cherish respect for their elders, and honor them and care for them, just as parents are honored and cared for by their lawful children, being supported by them in all abundance, both by their personal exertions and by innumerable contrivances. The Didache says, to everyone who asks, give. Do not ask for anything back, for Father wants gifts given to all from one's personal wealth. Anyone who gives according to the mitzvah is blessed and guiltless. Cursed is anyone else who receives, except the needy, who are also guiltless. Anyone who does not have a need must answer as to why he receives. So, in order to share part of the wealth, you had to take part of the money. You had to have an actual need for it. You didn't just go into the storehouse and take everything you wanted. These groups, of course, all observe the Sabbath. Philo says that they devote all their attention to the moral part of philosophy, using as instructors the laws of their country, which it would have been impossible for the human mind to devise without divine inspiration. Now these laws they are taught at other times indeed, but most especially on the seventh day, for the seventh day is accounted sacred, on which they abstain from all other employments, and frequent the sacred places, which are called synagogues, and there they sit according to their age and classes, the younger sitting under the elder and listening with eager attention in becoming order. The Panarian Epiphanius says, next I shall undertake to describe the sect of the Nazareans. They are Jews by nationality, from Gileaditis, Bashantis, and the Transjordan, as I've been told. Of course, this is the area around Pella where the Nazareans fled just before the destruction of Jerusalem. He says this sect practices Judaism in all respects and have scarcely any beliefs beyond the ones that I have mentioned, It too had been given circumcision, and it kept the same Sabbath and observed the same festivals, and certainly did not inculcate fate or astrology. Speaking of the Essenes, this then is the sect of the Essenes which lives the Jewish life in Sabbath observance, circumcision, and the keeping of the whole law. They had a belief that Yahuwah is only good. Philo says that then would indeed takes up the holy volume and reads it. This is speaking about the study practices of the Essenes. Another of the men of the greatest experience comes forward and explains what is not very intelligible, for a great many precepts are delivered in enigmatical modes of expression and allegorically, as the old fashion was, and thus the people are taught piety, using a threefold variety of definitions and rules and criteria, namely the love of Elohim, the love of virtue, and the love of mankind. Accordingly, the sacred volumes present an infinite number of instances of the disposition devoted to the love of Elohim, and a continued and uninterrupted purity throughout the whole of life, of a careful avoidance of oath and of falsehoods, and a strict adherence to the principle of looking on the deity as the cause of everything which is good and nothing which is evil. Now, this doctrine is reflected directly in the homilies of Clement, where it says, "For the scriptures have had joined to them many falsehoods against Elohim on this account. The prophet Moses, having by the order of Elohim delivered the law with the explanations to certain chosen men, some 70 in number, in order that they might instruct such of the people as they chose. After a little, the written law had added to it certain falsehoods contrary to the law of Elohim." And further, Kepha says, "Everything that is spoken or written against Elohim is false." So here we see the same doctrine in the mouth of Simon Peter. And of course, Simon Peter says that he got this doctrine directly from Yeshua. So anything in the Torah that paints Yahuwah in a negative light is false. Kepha gives a number of examples. For instance, saying that Yahuwah creates evil, or that he lies, or that he is deceitful, or anything like that. That's a something that's been asserted by men. In the Panarian, it says, "However, the sect of the Nazareans, would not accept the Pentateuch itself. It acknowledged that Moses and believed that he had received legislation, just not this legislation," they said, "but some other." And in the section on the Ebionites, he says they don't accept Moses' Pentateuch in its entirety. They reject certain sayings. So this is the same thing that we see being taught by Simon Peter, that the Torah itself is a mixture of truth with the interpolations of men that have been added over time. Hippolytus mentions that the Essenes have an appointed leader. He says all of them pay attention to the president, and whatever injunctions he will issue, they obey as law. Eusebius says that James, the brother of the master, succeeded to the government of the church in conjunction with the apostles. He has been called the just by all from the time of our Savior to the present day. Eusebius also goes through a list of what he calls the bishops of the circumcision, which is essentially all the Nazarene bishops, and it goes from James, the brother of Yeshua, to his cousin Simon Bar Clopas, to a number of other men. I think there was 14 total who were mostly descendants of Yeshua and his family themselves. In the Nazarene Acts, we see several references to James as the leader of the assembly. Here, Clement is writing that, having detailed to Kepha what purpose I had it conceived from the beginning, and how I had been distracted from my vain inquiries, and all those things that at first I intimated to you, my master Yaakov. Yaakov, of course, is James. His name was Jacob, not James, but the King James Version of the Bible changed his name to James because King James felt like his name should be in the Bible somewhere. So they basically just renamed Yaakov HaSadiq to James the Just. And just by tradition, that's kind of stuck. But so he's writing to Yaakov, so that I need not repeat the same things now, willingly agreed to travel with him. For that, said I, is just what I was most eagerly desirous of. So you can see that Clement was given this mission by James through Kepha to follow him and be a scribe. Later on he says, I compiled a scroll according to the Navi Emet and sent it to you, Master Yaakov, from Caesarea by his command. For Kepha said that he had received a commandment from you to send you every year an account of his sayings and doings. So we're generally, the thought is usually that Kepha is kind of like the main apostle. But here you see that Kepha is taking orders from James, who was the Mavaker. Furthermore, it says a week of years was completed from the passion of Yeshua. The Kahal of Yahuwah that was constituted in Jerusalem was most plentifully multiplied and grew, being governed with most righteous ordinances by Yaakov, who was ordained Mavaker in it by the Master. So according to the Nazarene Acts, it was Yeshua himself who placed James in charge. We also read that in the Gospel of Thomas, where it says the disciples said to Yeshua, we know that you are going to leave us. Who will be our leader? And Yeshua said to them, no matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. Nazarene Act says, so observe the greatest caution that you believe no teacher unless he bring from Jerusalem the testimonial of Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, or of whosoever may come after him. For no one, unless he has gone up thither and come and there has been approved as a fit and faithful teacher for preaching the word of Mashiach, unless he brings a testimonial thence, is by any means to be received. So basically, you were not qualified to teach in the Nazarene community unless you had the express approval of Yaakov, the just. And this is something we see in Paul's letters, where he is being asked for certain recommendations from the people he is going out and attempting to minister to, and he is coming up with all kind of excuses as to why he doesn't have these approvals or these recommendations. He says things like, shall we recommend ourselves to you? You are our recommendation. And he's basically trying to cover for why he doesn't have these approvals from James, the brother of Yeshua, because we can see that at some point there was a rift that formed between Paul and James, and I think possibly that this very admonition here, that this policy was possibly even put in place because Paul was going out and teaching a different doctrine than what James and the apostles were teaching. Hippolytus says that they have this doctrine to pray for their enemies. He says that every Essene takes an oath, first that he will worship the divinity, next that he will observe just dealings with men, and that he will in no way injure anyone, and that he will not hate a person who injures him or is hostile to him, but pray for them. This is reflected in Matthew 5:43, where Yeshua says, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those cursing you, do good to those hating you, pray for those insulting you and persecuting you, so that you become sons of your Father in heaven. So this same doctrine that was given by Yeshua, we see being followed by the Essenes. This is also reflected in the Didache, where it says, pay attention to these words, since this teaching is for you. Say good things to those who curse you. Pray about your enemies. Fast on account of those who persecute you. So these same doctrines given by Yeshua, kept by the Nazarenes, is also being kept by the Essenes. This is something interesting. This famous quote from the scripture, render to Caesar. And all of Christianity takes that to mean that we just need to pay our taxes. I wrote an article a while back saying that I believe that this had more to do with idolatry than it did with paying taxes. And then I run across this quote in Hippolytus a couple of years after I wrote that article that says the Essenes have, however, in the lapse of time, undergone divisions. They do not preserve their system of training after a similar manner, inasmuch as they have been split up into 4 parties. For some of them discipline themselves above the requisite orders of or rules of the order, so that even they would not handle a current coin of the country, saying that they ought not either to carry or to behold or fashion an image. Wherefore no one of those goes into a city, lest by doing he should enter in through a gate at which statues are erected, regarding it a violation of law to pass beneath images. So if you notice in Matthew 22:17, where these people are coming to test Yeshua to try and trip him up, and they ask him, they say to us, what do you think? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But knowing their wickedness, Yeshua says, why do you try me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin of the tax. And they brought him a silver piece. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to Elohim what is Elohim's. And having heard, they marveled and left him and went away. So what was it in that statement that was so revolutionary or so awe-striking that the people would marvel and then go away? Now, I highlighted here where it says, he asked, whose likeness and inscription is this? So what coin would he have been holding? Well, the silver denarius dates from 14 to 37 Common Era. On the front of this coin is Tiberius Caesar. It has the description, Tiberius Caesar Divini Augusti Filius. So Augustus is basically saying that Tiberius Caesar is the son of the divine Augustus. The back has Livia with the inscription Pontifex Maximus, or High Priest. Since the father of Tiberius, Octavian, Augustus Caesar, had been declared a god by the Roman Senate, Tiberius claims to be the son of Elohim, the son of God. So Yeshua is holding this coin with the image of a man, Tiberius Caesar, and is claiming that this man, Tiberius Caesar, is the son of God. And Yeshua is holding this coin. He says, whose image is this? And they say, Caesar. So what would you render to a man who is claiming to be God in the Jewish Torah? Well, I believe that the penalty for this would be stoning to death. So what should they render to Caesar? What is Caesar's that he should be rendered? Well, they should stone Caesar. They shouldn't be paying tribute to him. You see, taxes is a form of tribute. And so they were extracting tribute from the people. And Yeshua is basically calling them out on their hypocrisy. He's not saying to pay your taxes like Christianity teaches. He's speaking against idolatry. He's pointing out their hypocrisy and even asking him that question. So again, you see this connection to Yeshua and his followers versus the Essenes. Hippolytus goes on to say, but the adherents of another party, if they happen to hear anyone maintaining a discussion concerning Elohim and his laws, supposing such to be an uncircumcised person, they will closely watch him, and when they meet a person of this description in any place alone, they will threaten to slay him if he refuses to undergo the rite of circumcision. Now, if the latter does not wish to comply with this request, an Essene spares not, but even slaughters, and it is from this occurrence that they have received their appellation, being denominated by some Zealote, but by others Sakari. And the adherents of another party call no one master except the deity, even though one should be put to the torture or even killed. So basically what's going on is that when the Essenes hear somebody who they suspect is not circumcised discussing the Torah, that they will catch the person when he's alone and they'll give him a choice. You either circumcise yourself right now, or we're going to kill you. And if he refused to be circumcised, he would be killed. They would slaughter him. So how does this line up with what we see in the New Testament? Well, we see Paul preaching against circumcision, and he's speaking against this group called the circumcision party. Now, according to Hippolytus, there's two names for this group. There's the Zelote, or the Zealots, and the Sicarii. Now, if we look at the disciples of Yeshua, he has Judas Iscariot. Now, Iscariot is just a corruption of Sicarii. There's two letters that are switched. Other than that, it's the word Sicarii. And we have a number of references in the New Testament to the Zealots as being followers of Yeshua. James the Zealot, Simon the Zealot. James, whenever Paul comes to visit him in the book of Acts, he says, "Do you not see that we have myriads here who are zealous for the Torah?" So there's a number of zealot references in the New Testament. Now, the term Sicarii is what the Romans called the Sicarii, the knife people. I mean, Sicarii is a type of Sicar is a type of dagger. So they're basically calling them the knife people. I doubt that the Sicarii actually called themselves Sicarii. But given the description here in Hippolytus, I think it is perfectly reasonable to assume that this zealot party that was forcibly circumcising people probably called themselves the circumcision party, which is the group that we see opposed to Paul. And we also see Paul saying that he had Timothy circumcised because of the Jews. Of course, again, he says that he did not have him circumcised. There's a debate about the names Titus and Timothy, but they're basically the same name. It's just, I think, Titus is Latin and Timothy is a Greek form of it, but essentially it's the same name. And at one point, the New Testament says that this person was circumcised. At another point, it says that he refused to be circumcised. So we don't know for sure either way, but the point is that this is kind of fitting what we see in the New Testament. And also this last sentence, the adherents of another party of the Zealots, or the Sicarii, will not call anyone Lord except the deity. This, to me, reminds me of what we hear from the patriots that founded this country here in America. It was almost like a tagline for them: "No king but Jesus." And so I saw a definite connection there. But either way, it's all quite interesting. Hippolytus goes on to say, "For the disciplinary system in regard of the divinity according to these Jewish sects is one of greater antiquity than that of all nations. And so it is that the proof is at hand that all those Greeks who ventured to make assertions concerning Elohim or concerning the creation of existing things derive their principles from no other source than from the Jewish legislation. And among these may be particularized the Pythagoreans especially, and the Stoics, who derived by their systems while resident among the Egyptians by having become disciples of the Jews." So I did a video on this connection to the Pythagoreans a while back. Hippolytus is saying that the Pythagoreans got their doctrine from the Jewish Torah, and that the Jewish Torah is of a greater antiquity. So I've mentioned before that I read a book recently that was trying to say that the Essenes came from the Pythagoreans, whereas according to Hippolytus it's the other way around, that Pythagoras got his doctrines from the Jewish believers, or specifically Pythagoras was actually carried captive to Babylon at the same time the Jews were captive there. So, and there is a connection with him and the Magi in Babylon. And so I think these groups were all closely associated together, and that Pythagoras got his doctrine from that. Josephus says the Essenes were excused from an imposition of taking an oath of loyalty to Herod, and that these men, the Essenes, lived the same kind of life as those whom the Greeks call Pythagoreans. So Josephus is again connecting the Essenes to the Pythagoreans. And as I mentioned in other videos, there is a book, you can find it free online, the Plutarch's Parable. And in Plutarch's Parable, the author of this book shows that there are Pythagorean sacred numbers in the book of Luke. And so this raises a question. Okay, well, why is the Pythagorean secret sacred numbers in the Gospel of Luke? Unless the author of the Gospel of Luke was a Pythagorean, or more accurately, the Pythagoreans got their sacred numbers from the Essenes, and the author of Luke was an Essene. The author of the book Plutarch's Parable theorizes that the Gospel of Luke and Acts was actually written by Plutarch, who was a Pythagorean. His first name was, a lot of these people that were, nobility and members of, like a priestly class. In Rome, they would be given multiple names, so they could have like a leader or a Caesar or someone adopt them into their family. So then they would be given an additional name. So if you've ever watched one of these movies where there's a person of nobility and they're introduced by their full name, and so there's like 10 names that are said, then that's what this is. Now, one of Plutarch's names, his first name was actually Lucius. So Lucius, Plutarch, something or another, which would explain why the gospel was called Luke, if it was written by someone named Lucius. But it's an interesting book. I recommend reading it. The author of Plutarch's Parable goes into great length to try and prove that Yeshua had a child with Mary Magdalene and that sort of thing. I'm not really opposed to that, but I don't think they make a really good case for that issue in that book. But the Pythagorean connection makes it worth reading the book just to see that aspect of it. So, nevertheless, you do see this connection, and it further reinforces the case that I'm trying to make right now, in that the Essenes and the Nazareans, Ebionites, Jewish Christian groups, that these were all the same group, which is something I've been trying to point out on a number of my videos. I do believe that the connections are there. I believe that there's enough connections, enough pieces of circumstantial evidence to where at some point it ceases to be just a coincidence. So, thank you for listening. I pray that this has been a blessing to you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Shalom.